Please welcome Executive Director of Innovation and Growth for GDC Festival of Gaming, Mark DeLora.
Good morning. Is everybody awake? I'm glad you are. I'm not quite awake yet. But I hope you've been having a great week here at GDC, and welcome to day 4, or 11. I've lost track. Do you know that flow state you get into when you play a really, really good game? How many of us have lost a weekend, or maybe a couple of years, maybe that's just me, playing World of Warcraft? Well, you can thank our keynote speaker, Rob Pardo, for that. Rob spent over 20 years at Blizzard, where he led design on StarCraft, Brood War, Warcraft 3, and World of Warcraft, games that didn't just define genres, they were cultural phenomena. On his way out the door at Blizzard, he shipped Hearthstone for good measure. In 2006, Time magazine named Rob one of the 100 most influential people in the world, and if you've made games in the last 25 years, there's a good chance his fingerprints are on the way you think about design. His latest company, Bonfire Studios, just dropped a public demo of their debut title, Archeron. Looks like he's about to do it again. Please welcome the man who made you a better game designer and cost you an embarrassing amount of sleep, Rob Pardo.
Good morning, GDC. I know it's probably been a late night for everyone. I'm Rob Pardo. I'm the CEO of Bonfire Studios. And it's actually really great to be back on stage at GDC. You know, GDC has always been, to me, such a special community because it's really where game developers, really share openly how we make games so that we can all be better. What I'm hoping to do today is just to share a few things that I've learned from over the years trying to build games that endure and last. I'm currently launching a new game with my team at Bonfire, and it's called Archeron. We just ran a playtest during Steam Next Fest, and we're hoping to launch later this year. It's exciting, and it's stressful, and honestly, it's been a little humbling. And it's been a really long time since I've stood up here at GDC. I think over 15 years or so by now. And then when I was trying to think of like, well, what am I even going to name this talk? I've been recently, watching like the trailer for the Odyssey by Chris Nolan. So it made me realize something. This year is actually going to be the 10-year anniversary of Bonfire, which made it kind of oddly appropriate, because the journey of building Archron has definitely had a few Odyssey moments of its own. Harrowing adventures, some difficult navigation challenges, a lot of teamwork, and more than a few moments where we weren't sure if the ship would survive the trip. But the truth is, the Odyssey didn't start just 10 years ago with Bonfire for me. It started probably even earlier in my career. So to give you a little bit of my history, I've been making games for a very long time now. And it even started before this. I actually started Interplay Productions in 1994 as a game tester. But really, I kind of consider the start of my game developer journey being when I started at Blizzard in 1997 on the original StarCraft. And over the years, I've really had the chance to work on a lot of different projects in creative leadership roles until leaving Blizzard in 2014. And I think one thing that's kind of been unusual about my career is that I've had the chance to work across so many different kinds of games. I've worked on everything from real-time strategy games to MMORPGs and even a card battler. And early in my time at Blizzard, I was a game designer. But after World of Warcraft, my role shifted to building the game design discipline and leading projects more from an executive producer role. And each game had different challenges to overcome. But I've had the chance to see a lot of game development processes from different perspectives. But it hasn't all been successes. A lot of the games, there's also some of the games I worked on that didn't survive. And while it's always extremely painful to cancel a project, oftentimes those experiences probably taught me even more than the successes did. But when I look back on the journey, I really realize how incredibly fortunate that I've had in my career. Because I've had the chance to work on games that endured far longer than anyone expected. But more importantly, I've had a chance to work with some really, truly amazing teams. And I want to be really clear about something. I'm not standing up here today as an expert who can tell you how to make games that last forever. I don't think anyone could do that. All I can really do is share a few stories, some lessons from my successes, some lessons from my failures, and hopefully something on that journey might prove to be helpful to you today. So, amazingly enough, World of Warcraft turns 22 years old this year. And back when we launched it, we really had no idea that it would endure this long. We were kind of figuring maybe 4 or 5 years tops. In retrospect, it obviously sounds very naive, but back then the industry hadn't yet coined the term live service game yet. Nowadays, there's even a newer term going around, which is called like the forever game. Kind of the idea that you could intentionally design a game that lasts for decades. I can totally understand why that's appealing. But really, when I look back on the games that I worked on that did last, it's not really how it happened. I think now, when executives and investors look at how lucrative some of these games have become, they started to invest a lot of money in the industry trying to create the next big forever game. And you'll see pitch decks that look something like this, like game A plus game B equals massive business. And I think it's, obviously can get studios started a lot of money, but, I think, it's a little strange to me. So I use this example up there because, Animal Crossing happens to be one of my favorite games, and World of Warcraft is a game that I've worked on. And the pitch decks really make it sound really easy, but honestly, I think it dramatically underestimates how hard it is to create either of those games in the first place. And as a huge Animal Crossing fan, and someone that also has been designing games for a long time. I think if you handed me a team today, I'm not even sure I could authentically recreate Animal Crossing, let alone combining the best parts of it and combining it with another iconic game. So I think it was like over 15 years ago that I came to a GDC, and I was super excited to see the talk on Animal Crossing. And I went in there wanting to hear all their design wisdom, also just being a fan. And I remember they showed one of their key pillars as Animal Crossing as a communication tool. And honestly, my mind was kind of blown. I had expected pillars to be more about the importance of collectability, or maybe something that really pointed to their non-traditional goal structure in the game. But a communication tool, wasn't really something that made sense until they explained it more and more. But I think that's the challenge a lot of times with the games, is by the time that we get to play a game, we only get to see the final result. Great games, are very intuitive to play, and they're very simple. And really, all the mistakes, the learning, and the North Stars that led the team to the final product are long buried. And speaking of buried bodies, I would say that every project that I've worked on has had a lot of setbacks too. There's been pivots, there's been dead ends, and there's been moments where just things weren't working. And it's often felt like we had to build the game 3 different times before we finally got to the right one. Almost every project had at least one major disaster that we had to recover from. So I'll use Warcraft 3, I think, is a really good example. So Warcraft 3, we originally announced it at ECTS in 1999, and it was actually a pretty different game back then. We were trying to push beyond the traditional RTS formula from StarCraft, and we even tried to coin a new genre term called role-playing strategy. We had really de-emphasized a lot of the resource collection, and the focus was much more on heroes and smaller groups of units. And we worked on that game for a pretty long time, but eventually, we just had to kind of admit to ourselves that it wasn't working. And we had to take a really step back and pivot it back into something that looked a little bit more traditional. But we also did keep some of the ideas that did work, heroes, leveling, items, and a lot of those did end up becoming some of the defining features of Warcraft 3. So then the natural thing becomes okay, well, we had these setbacks, we had these problems that happened, so let's do the thing all game developers do, and we're going to do a postmortem. And we're going to really try to discover, what are the things that maybe would have helped us avoid those disasters, so on the next project, it can go a little bit smoother. But I think what ended up happening was we go into the next project, and a lot of the same patterns would still apply, but the disasters would show up in very different ways. It'd be different problems, different setbacks, and I think over time I had to learn to accept something. These blow-ups, the struggle, the pivots, they're really just part of the creative discovery process. And in fact, I've kind of started using a more playful metaphor of that phase of development, which is what this slide is. It's like Mirkwood, from The Hobbit, where I feel like there's always this point in development where, everything seems to be lost, and you're there with your team, and there really doesn't seem to be any way out. But I think what I found is, the teams that continue to stick together and try to find, keep on answering those questions, eventually do find a way out, just not necessarily the way that you thought was the way in. Whoops. All right, I need some water for this one. So maybe there's another way to create the forever game, because my latter time at Blizzard, we really got to the point where we could put all the best amazing talent on a team. We had all the resources we needed. And, honestly, we could spend as long as we wanted to, which, I think should be the formula for success. But I would say that that didn't solve the problems either. So what Project Titan was, it was intended to be the game that was going to be more ambitious and was going to one day replace World of Warcraft. Didn't quite work out that way, but I think some of my most important learning from my career came from a project that never actually shipped. And, I'll have to admit to you, it's like I think I made every mistake that you can possibly make running a large game project. I started by having us build the technology before we really knew what the game really was. I pushed for innovation and ambition in every direction. We're building a new IP, we're defining new gameplay, we're designing a new world, all at the same time. And I also really allowed the team to scale too quickly before we'd even really found the core fun and the core gameplay loop. And I think worst of all, I really wanted to hold on to the game director role in that, even though my role had already scaled much bigger at Blizzard. And really, game director is a full-time job, not a part-time one. So I think in hindsight, I was overall just overly ambitious and foolish and not realistic. And eventually I had to make the call to cancel Titan, and it was, very painful. It was years of work, huge team, and a lot of ambition that just stopped. And just like I get some credit for, some of the amazing games and success we did at Blizzard, on this one I got to claim sole responsibility for leading the biggest project failure in Blizzard history. But something interesting did happen next. A small group, from that team, kind of started working with the code base and, a lot of all the different IP that we had, and really were trying to focus on what was working within Titan, which was kind of like a lot of the battleground sort of combat between all the different classes. And that prototype eventually became Overwatch. And, I left a couple years before the game was able to successfully come out, but I was like super happy and proud that the team was able to take something out of Titan's ashes and launch something to the world. So there is always a way to find your way out of Mirkwood. So I probably haven't been that helpful yet because I feel like I'm just telling you all the things that don't work. But at the same time, knowing what doesn't work, I think, is half the battle. But I think, maybe also start talking about some of the things that I found counterintuitive things that have helped projects be successful. And I would say one really good example is over the years, like the press will sometimes come up to me and they'll interview me and always ask that question of, well, how do you know when a game is going to be a hit? And I'll usually give them a very similar sort of anecdote. And I'll tell them, invariably there's always this point in the development process, this moment, where the team starts extending playtests. And they end up loving playing the game almost more than making the game itself. And usually at that point, have to have some version of sitting down with the team and saying, hey, you can't be taking those long lunch breaks anymore because we actually need to make this thing, not just play it all the time. And I would say that that moment has kind of always been one of the truest measures to me that a game is going to be successful. And I'll tell you, like, on those games that ended up getting canceled, I can tell you they never were able to reach that milestone. So, why is this so important? Well, I think it's really because when a team becomes more interested in playing their own game than anything else, something really special starts to happen. Because there's plenty of finished games out in the world that they could be playing instead, but they're playing this development build that's not even finished yet. But what happens is you start seeing this virtual cycle because the development team is now not only playing their favorite game, but they get to make it better every single day. And they really become obsessed with improving it. They start experimenting with new ideas, and you even see developers on the team get genuinely upset when they miss a playtest. So I think what I'm really trying to say with all this is the most important lesson, or the most important milestone, I would say, in development is when a team deeply falls in love with the game that they're making. And really, in my opinion, if developers don't love playing the game, it's kind of hard to imagine players eventually loving the game either. And the thing is, when a team does fully love the game, something really powerful does happen. They stop chasing what they think the audience wants and really start building the game that they genuinely believe in. And that authentically is often what players end up responding to. So I'll give you an example from early in my career, during StarCraft, going into StarCraft Brood War. Like I was, obsessed myself with playing the game. I'd be, trying to compete on the ladder. I was finding like all the best players. I'd watch their games. They helped me really balance the game. I even created my own community tournament. I'd like create the rule structure. Like on lunch during lunch breaks at Blizzard, all the Blizzard team would huddle around and we'd watch the top players play. And it wasn't because I was trying to become a community manager or a tournament organizer. I just selfishly wanted to make the game better, and I knew by getting them to compete with one another, it would kind of help me be able to do the right thing for the game. And, it's like, making like great StarCraft balance was never like one of the big pillars. It was never like in the design document as the crucial thing to do. It really was born out of just this love of wanting to continue to make the game better and better for these players. And what I think was really interesting is, when StarCraft came out, there was no esports scene, but I think because of that obsession with really trying to make great game balance, it allowed one to grow up around it. And I think it's just such a good example of like, when a team really loves the thing that they're creating and play it a lot, you have these unexpected outcomes that you didn't necessarily plan for in the first place. So the trick is, how do you design a production schedule that has this milestone of falling in love with the game? It's not like you can just plot it like we're going to hit that in September 2022. So I think the better way really to think about it is you can't really schedule for it, but I do think you can try to create the conditions where something worthy, of lasting might emerge, and then really the players are the one that are going to ultimately decide if it deserves to. All right, so that's a little bit of my historical journey and a few things. I want to head back to the Odyssey, and I'll tell you, we didn't know we're going to be spending this long making Archeron. I certainly would never stand up here and say, oh, you really want to have 8 to 10 year long development cycles, that's what it takes. Far from it. I think it was more that we just want to make sure that we end up with something that we're really proud of. And I think, even looking back now, building a lasting game feels a lot less like executing a plan and more like navigating a journey. And this is where I think the Odyssey metaphor lands again, because there really are storms, and there's wrong turns, and there are discoveries you didn't expect, because game development rarely follows a straight path, and this is where I do think it is much more like the Odyssey, or at least it has been for Archeron. So I'm going to talk now about some of the ways we approached building Archeron and maybe some of the principles we had along the way. So the first one I would say is really starting with the team. So when we went out to trying to find investment, this is actually the title slide, so I used some artwork from Hearthstone. And, we very intentionally weren't really starting with a game pitch. Because to me, that was really intentional. I've seen too many projects start with, this big idea, and then you just try to hire people to execute it. But I think the challenge is when you're trying to make something new, I think the order should be reversed. And when we pitched the company for investment, my co-founder, Min, was actually quite surprised that we weren't going to pitch a game at all. I told him that pitching a game without a team, was going to really set us up for challenges for two major reasons. First, it just may not be the best game for that team. And second, I also knew that invariably whatever game we pitched was going to evolve and change, and it's really better if our investors are aligned on the company vision, not the game vision. So early on, there weren't a lot of us, so we really did kind of spend our time on recruiting, but also, really trying to decide what kind of company that we wanted to build. And then this kind of now leads me to the next part, which is what you really want to do is find the idea that the team is most suited to create. So what we did when we were building that early team and we didn't have enough of a team yet to fully start development, we still started generating ideas. And we called them seeds. And what happened was we really encouraged everyone at Bonfire to pitch ideas. It didn't really matter what discipline you were. And the ideas kind of were all over the place. We would have artists that might just show 200 pictures of reference art, but you really couldn't understand what the gameplay loop was. Making fun of Min a little bit, who had never really pitched, I think, games before. Like, he started pitching a game through a music video and took us on an emotional journey. But again, really hard to compare it to the art reference deck. So we finally had to formulate a little bit of a structure so we could at least compare all the ideas against one another. So we created this short deck, which this is what we called the seed. And really each slide, you're just answering one question. So one was really just the core concept of what is the game. There's a reference DNA slide for whatever inspirations you might be taking. What is just the very most simple part of the gameplay loop. And then something about the world and the setting and the fantasy of the IP. And that was really it. So we ended up with a lot of pretty interesting ideas. So we ended up with everything from a vampire survival game to a game that was kind of a riff off of the movie Gladiator. Imagine that Maximus, retired, went back and became a farmer, but then had to defend his farm from zombies. And then one that blew my mind was one of our engineers pitched the idea that was least likely to come out of him, which was a dance-off game where you bought cosmetic shoes. It's a fun time, and all told, we ended up with around 35 of these game seeds. And I think it really showed the full creative range of the studio. But then we had to figure out, okay, well, how do we start whittling this down? And what we ended up doing is very scientific. I gave everyone on the team 5 Post-it notes, and they had to sign their name. And one of the rules was you couldn't wait at the end so you can make sure that your votes counted the most. You just had to authentically put the Post-its on the seeds that you were most excited about. And really all the conversation was really interesting because it really started showing where the product values in the studio were. Because it wasn't really, there was the ones that had lots of Post-its, the ones that had very few, but the ones that were in the middle created the most interesting conversations. Because I think what we started learning was, we wanted to, for one thing, make games that had interesting imaginative worlds. So eventually, we kind of settled on 7 of these seeds that we just wanted to spend a little more time with. And to stick with the metaphor of farming and gardening, we're going to grow the seeds into saplings. So what we did with each of these now, we went from a single authorship approach, because each of the seeds was pitched by an individual. Now what we had to do was we're going to work as a team and kind of in like 2 to 3 week sprints, build out a much longer pitch deck, with kind of the concept of, hey, we could pitch this to publishers, but what was really cool for us was we're actually making these decks to pitch us on the tail end of the whole process. And it was a fun time, like good example is we actually even created all these mood inspiration boards for each of the saplings, because everyone is able to kind of apply their disciplines, to the pitch deck, whether or not figuring out like what the tech stack might end up being, what are the deeper gameplay loops, what are things that, might players want to, keep them engaged for 10, 100, 1,000 hours. And all that went into the decks over the 2 to 3 weeks. And then, again, we have to figure out, well, how are we going to make a decision? So one of the first things I did was I had everyone on the team go and stack rank the saplings in the order that you thought Bonfire should develop them. And this don't include the saplings that you didn't think we should develop. And this ended up being showing a lot of really interesting data because there is a lot of enthusiasm across all of them. Matter of fact, I think 6 of the 7 had at least one #1 vote, and I would say the minimum of 4 showed up across all of them. So it still was not very clear how are we going to decide which of these games we're going to make. So, we spent a couple days, and one of the things that everyone had to do was really defend their stack ranking. And this was very, very interesting because people took very, very different approaches. So some people would do the stack ranking that, hey, this is going to be the biggest commercial opportunity, which, I don't know how any of us know which games are going to be the most successful commercial opportunity, but I thought it was a fair way for people to approach it. Some came at it from a place of game they're either most passionate to make or maybe just most passionate to play. We also had an engineer that had the really smart technical strategy approach to build this tech stack, in order of the games that we would build. But ultimately, I think everyone was really surprised to hear all the different perspectives. And I think, as a team, we learned a lot about one another, but we also kind of learned a lot about where everyone's passions and skills were. So before we actually took all the saplings into Thunderdome, I wanted them to stack rank one more time with all this new information, but this time I gave everyone a prompt. And the prompt looks something like this. And it really is this concept of, out of all these different ideas, which one of these could the team, knock out of the park, so to speak. And I think that goes back to one of my fundamental beliefs about giving you the best chance to make a game is, make the game that already leans into all the skills and passions that your team already has. Like, why go off and try to build a game that, may sound great on paper, but the team isn't enthusiastic or, doesn't necessarily have the skills to make it. So we did land on a game, and this was the seed version of the game. So I'll show you the sapling as well, but the seed version was Dungeon Royale, and this was kind of, some of the wording that we had in there, which is this whole twist on the traditional dungeon crawler. So the idea is that you end up as this prisoner of this demon, and you're fighting to survive and escape this dungeon. So very Diablo-esque, right? And you would explore the dungeon, gather loot, and then decide if you're going to cooperate with the other players or betray them, and then reach the overfiend first. So kind of this crazy betrayal, PvP, PvE game. When it moved to the sapling phase, it became cult. Because now the team has put in their own creativity into it. And, it still had a lot of the similar elements, but now it was a procedurally generated dungeon crawler. And the idea now was players must escape from the clutches of an evil cult and find a way to stop it from summoning a demon. And then along the way, players would find weapons and loot that would grant them powers. And then when all players have the same goal, they may choose to cooperate. Sometimes the right choice is to band together to defeat the demon. Other times, players may increase their odds of surviving by killing a fellow prisoner and taking their loot. But players must decide who and when to trust, and in the end, only a handful of players will survive, escape, and emerge victorious. And this was just kind of the theory of maybe what the camera angle would look like. So at this point, because it was nearly unanimous, the team was really excited, and we're really ready to move forward and start making this game. But there is one thing I always know about when you're starting a game. The game that you start with a vision is not going to be the game you finish with. So if you're making a really new game with a new vision, I think one of the trickiest things to do is where to start. I think one of the real challenges is if you're doing something really new and not derivative, you can't really just start with the waterfall schedule and imagine that you're going to get there and plan out all the features in some sort of order. So really, I've kind of started thinking about it in a different way over the years. So what I think the first approach is to really try to find the minimum lovable game. And another way to maybe think about it is, like, if you can really look at the entire vision of the game, like, how would you build it from the inside out is another way to think about it. So, like, if you imagine this whole game one day working, what's the core experience that everything else is going to build on top of? And it's really got to be able to think about it, because if that one part isn't great, then everything else that layers on top of it isn't really going to work either. I know this approach is maybe a little bit different than the vertical slice, which I think is more helpful if you're pitching a game, less helpful for building a game. But with this approach, I'll just give you a couple other examples from past projects. So I think Hearthstone is a really easy example to pick out because it already is kind of 2D. So they were really able to find the game so much in a Flash prototype. So they created all the card rules, were able really to play it in Flash, and really found what was really fun about the game. And I wouldn't say an easy way, but let's say an easier to explain way. But then, if you get to, let's say, a much more complicated game like World of Warcraft, we knew that was going to be a really huge world. So in that case, we were really kind of looking for, what was the core quest adventure loop? And there's this area in the human lands called Northshire Valley. So we really wanted to make sure that was working really well before we started building all these lands, across the entire game. With with our game, Colt, which one day would be Archeron, I think what we really identified was the combat was going to be super, super key. Especially since, we knew we were going to have dungeon crawling elements, but we really wanted team-based PvP. So we went on a journey of very different prototypes. I think at first we started with much more of a Diablo-esque top-down point-and-click. But we really just couldn't get the responsiveness and the fast-paced team coordination that we thought was going to be key to making the game great. We evolved it to more of a battle right, kind of MOBA-esque sort of control scheme. And, it was better, but it just still didn't feel like it was going to be great. And then we also experimented a little bit with Dark Souls. That was like all in the zeitgeist at the time. But I think while we got some interesting ideas from it, it clearly wasn't going to be the foundation either. But then, one of the days, someone on the team actually hacked the camera a little bit, so it was more top-down, and then made it so you could spin the camera on the axis. And that's really when we found something really interesting and special. And when we started playing around with the new camera and controls and the responsiveness, we kind of knew that this was it, and we felt like, okay, I guess fourth time's the charm. But the thing was, we've been prototyping for a long time, and our engineers had been building a network model for that early prototype, the first approach. And the engineers came and explained to us that they would actually need to rewrite the entire network layer to be more of a predictive client-server architecture similar to Overwatch, which was obviously going to be a lot of work. So, they asked the question of, well, what would you guys do if we couldn't get the combat to work from a network standpoint? And then really without skipping a beat, our designer said, we'd pick a new game. So they went out and did the estimates on how long it was going to take. And they said, well, it's going to take 9 months, not just to rebuild the network layer, but it also was going to take down our whole engineering team. So it meant none of the rest of the team would be able to have engineering support for 9 months while they did this work. So again, without really having to think too long about it, we said, well, can you guys start tomorrow? And we made the hard decision. But I honestly think sometimes this is where teams can get in trouble, because I think it'd been very easy for us to say, you know what, we're just going to try to make it better as we go along. We don't really want to bite off that year. Maybe it'll be good enough, or maybe we'll be able to polish it in alpha, But I think what often happens is if you don't do the hard things first and you do the hard thing, you're not going to be able to catch up later. And I think, even calling back to Titan for a second, I think that was one of the big core missteps that I made was not making sure that we found a core game loop before we started scaling the team. So a lot of what I think this kind of phase of a project is almost, instead of calling it pre-production, I almost think of it as you have to imagine the same game together with your team. So you're having to make game references, writing design documents, all kind of this effort so that we're working towards the same vision of a game that doesn't exist yet. But I really like getting away out of that phase as soon as possible and moving into the next phase, which I really think what I like to call is playing the game to make the game phase. And once we we're able to finish that rewrite, we're able to now start playing the game and starting to get that sense of it. And this is really when we started our daily playtest ritual. And what's really kind of cool about this phase of development, you don't really need design documents anymore because the game itself is the design document. You're just, if you have an idea, you can just put it in, and it really cuts through all the bullshit, to be honest, and all the noise. Because if there's any debate, you can just put it in the game and test it out. And we really became very playtest driven. So what would happen is we would start with the morning playtest, and then we'd have a post-game huddle. Everyone would give feedback, and then the developers could go back, make some tweaks, some changes, and the next morning, you're playing a better version of the same game. And this really just kind of starts becoming the cycle for a very long time. But then something very unexpected happened, and there was this global pandemic. And overnight, we went from an in-person studio to being a remote studio. And that was very, very challenging for us. But I think one of the things that really saved us was the game itself, because we were already in this morning playtest loop. So it really was a way for us to really stay connected to one another, because every day you would get matched with a couple people across the project that maybe used to be right next to you, but now we're in kind of separate work streams and you barely got to see anymore. So I think it really was the thing that allowed us to continue to develop the game even during that really tough time period. And it was kind of sometime during the pandemic, before we'd really gone back to the office at all, that there's this subtle shift that was starting to happen on the team. The team started becoming upset when we canceled playtests. And it wasn't like it was on any specific day. But it was kind of this thing that started as a whisper, but eventually became more and more unmistakable for us. We had the sign, the thing had happened. The team had fallen in love with the game. And I think it was really at this point we started gathering a lot more momentum and a lot more alignment, because now we were kind of in that loop of the team was now working on and playing their favorite game every day. So, to go back to my Odyssey metaphor for a second, there's a lot of things that obviously happened since then, because that was back in probably like 2021. And we still had a lot of things to overcome. There's plenty of challenges, pivots, evolutions. I don't imagine this is the slide where the future, Archeron postmortem will go one day that gets more into the details. But for today, I actually want to just fast forward now to where we're actually at. So, like I've mentioned, the game is now called Archeron, which is, by the way, I could probably do a talk just on the journey of finding that name, but I'll leave that for later. And I'm not going to pitch to you guys the whole game today, because we have videos up, that does a much better job than I would do anyways. But if you want to go up there and wish list for us, that'd be well appreciated. But what I will do is, just because I've shown you guys now kind of some of those seeds and saplings, I'll just maybe show you some of the things that have changed since then. So now, instead of escaping a dungeon, like it was in Colt, you actually ascend a mysterious tower. So each match begins with 15 teams of 3 entering the tower at the same time. And then to move forward, your team has to survive the floor, claim a beacon, which usually means winning a PvP showdown with 1 or more teams. And then this process will continue until there'll be only 2 teams that reach the top, and it'll resolve in a final 3v3 showdown. So maybe another way to think about it is it's like a big, deadly game of musical chairs. And then also, making a new IP is very, very hard. Originally Colt was in kind of this moody, living fantasy world. But we had this moment in development where one of our artists posed this question: what if everyone was dead? And it actually took us in a completely different direction for the franchise. And where we landed was, as a player, you play as an echo, which is a soul bound here to this afterlife because of unfinished business. You're carrying a memory that anchors you to this place, and those anchors will recreate the tower each cycle, pulling fragments of people, places, and moments from the living world into existence. And then all the weapons and relics and artifacts are actually tied to choices that matter deeply in another life. And those memories manifest as the powerful abilities of the player in the tower. And the world within the tower is always shifting, because memory itself isn't stable, so neither is the tower. And then we've kept the dungeon crawling elements, but we've definitely shifted it and evolved it to being very PvP first. So as you move through the tower, you are constantly looting and shaping your build, and you get items by fighting monsters, completing quests, opening chests, buying items from shrines, and often by taking them from other players. But the PvE is not the goal of Archeron. It really just exists to create pressure between teams. In an RPG, you might complete a quest safely with a group, but in Archeron, that same quest might draw another team to get stolen or turn into an ambush. And then instead of players starting as heroes, we turn the heroes into items. And most of these items belong to our world heroes, which we call Eternals. And each of them have a special ability, but are also imbued with the memories of those Eternals. But what it means is, like each game, a player can create a new playstyle on the fly. But also, from a world standpoint, if you collect 4 items that belong to the same Eternal set, you can actually transform into one of them for a brief time within that game. And this is like our current lineup of Eternals. So you can kind of see, a little bit of Colt still in Archeron, but you can also just kind of see how much things evolved and shift just through kind of all the Odyssey of discovery that we've had along the way. So, this might be where I could end the talk, right? Because we've survived Mirkwood, we've gone on our Odyssey, so this would just be normally the happy ending. But I did leave an important part out. We're not actually to the finish line yet. This might be a little bit of what development looked like, but the thing I haven't really talked about yet are players. So another concept that I like to bring up, because we obviously are very playtest driven, and developers are great playtesters because we really care about the game. We can look at things through the lens of developer eyes, but we also know exactly how the game works, and we tend to play very nice with one another in a PvP game. So we end up also being a very broken audience. So like something I've always thought is really important is starting to really iterate as well with your future players in your community. So, and this can, again, take shapes in different ways on games. If you think about like the inside-out concept, there's another way you can kind of look at it. So for us, like a few years ago now, we actually found some playtesters that were very highly skilled, just so we could see what highly skilled players would do with our combat and item system, so we could really build the competitive depth of the game. And then we've kind of slowly exposed the game to widening circles of players. But the thing is, when you start doing this, players are going to be pretty vocal, and they're going to have opinions, and they're going to expect, their opinions going to be heard. And they don't always have the best way of explaining themselves. So one example, one story I think is kind of funny, it happened during like World of Warcraft, which during the World of Warcraft like alpha beta test, we were testing the game like well over a year before we eventually launched it. And one of the things that we did, much like I mentioned in Archeron getting competitive players, in WoW, we were really connected to a lot of the high-end Uber guilds and EverQuest and Dark Age of Camelot, and we invited them all over. So they brought their guilds over and played the crap out of World of Warcraft. And one story I thought was really interesting is there was this very influential player in one of the guilds, and his character name was Indalamar. And he was the best warrior kind of in the alpha, and would create these videos showing his techniques and showing how good he was at the game, but also how powerful warriors were. And I had to think long and hard about if I was going to make a nerf to the warrior or not, which eventually I did. And then Indalamar was so angry and indignant, he wrote a 16-page blog post with all the reasons why this was a mistake, and then didn't just want to call my boss, the CEO of Blizzard, but his boss at our parent company to get me fired. So, I think we just kind of got to realize about players, if you make something you really love, they're going to love it too, and they're going to care really deeply, deeply about it. In this particular case, I got to know him, and I ended up hiring him as a designer at Blizzard, and he had a very long, successful career. They even made a WoW trading card game character out of him. So, I just think you really got to respect the players in your community, because they're going to form opinions. They're going to talk about the meta. They're going to complain when things are off. They're going to teach one another. They're going to criticize your game, and they're also going to defend it publicly as well. And this is kind of the framing I really like to think about it is, the game, when it really works and becomes part of someone's life, they don't really experience it as your product. They experience it as theirs. And, that's really what we want for Archron. So, present day, is Archron going to be a forever game? I would never in a million years stand up here and say that is going to be so, because it's not up to me, and it's honestly not up to my team as well. And it's also, a very different market nowadays. There are hundreds of great games competing for attention right now. Players are skeptical, attention is fragmented, and the bar is sky high. And if you're building a new PvP live service game, it's even harder. Ultimately, it's up to players. There's hundreds of great games out there competing for their attention, and we have to prove that we're worthy. But we do believe in the game that we're building. And this is the year we're going to give it our best shot to find out find the players who love it. And we have a long road still ahead of us. And honestly, we're excited to see where it leads. So, I think something that I've had to come to terms with over my long career is that you only get to make so many games. And the journey that Archron has been on has been an extremely long one. I've learned much about game development, and more importantly, I've grown so much as a leader for my own team. What I hope for everyone here at GDC is that you get to make something that fills you with the same sense of pride when it gets out into the world. Something that you love dearly, something you're willing to expose to reality, and something you're humble enough to let evolve. As game makers, we don't get to decide if a game lasts. At best, we get to earn the right to find out. And I know the industry has changed. It's a lot harder to break in, and development costs are going up. And we've all seen how many layoffs have happened in the AAA space. So to those of you who are maybe executives or business leaders, I'll leave you with one final thought. And that is that if you actually create a game that truly endures, it's really incredibly difficult. And if you're fortunate enough to launch one of those games, the rewards can be extraordinary. But in my experience, if you build a game like that, it also means that you've built an incredible development team. And personally, I think the game team is more valuable than the game itself. So treasure that team, nurture that team, give them the autonomy to keep taking care of the players. Because the thing that made the game special in the first place was the people who built it. So thank you all, and have a great GDC.
Thank you for joining us this morning. Please start making your way over to South Hall. The festival hall will open at 10 a.m.